Okay, so this is understanding the spider web. This monstrosity is the animation controller for 7 Days to Die that Zith worked tirelessly on, and I wanted to share a bit about how I think it works. I may be wrong in a few things because my information is purely anecdotal, but what I do know has enabled me to write my own controllers to swap out animations and call animations as needed, so some of this is probably right. Alright, let's start. First, if you want to follow along, load the tutorial template by Zith and bring Asia Elderly Man X from Assets, A20 Entities, Hinabisi into the scene. You see that's a dude right here. And ensure that he has the A20 NPC controller V1 on him. So what you do is you click there and you see he's got, well, let me move the A20 whatever controller. You get that from Assets A20 Tutorial Assets A20 Controllers. Assets, tutorial assets. And of course, since I'm recording a video, I can't find it for shit. There it is. So I'm just going to take this controller. I'm going to have him here. I'm going to swap this out with this dude right here. Okay? So that's actually the actual controller. Alright, let's start. Make sure you have an animator tab right up here and have the Asian man highlighted, which I do. So that's what allows me to see this monstrosity right here. Make sure you have the parameters selected instead of layers. Because right now I have parameters selected. Okay, that way you can kind of see what I'm looking at. See the list of stuff? These are animation parameters, and I'm going to talk about how these tie into 7 Days to Die and what animation gets selected. Once it's all loaded, find the green entry square. That's this right here. And yes, I'll continue to call these rectangle squares. Deal with it. Okay. This is the default load point. This is where it all starts. Click on the brown line. This is the default path from entry, and it leads to a square called spawn state. This is called the default transition, and there can only be one in the entire controller, or this layer, I believe. Yeah, this layer. Click on the spawn state square, and you'll see that there's an animation tied to this square, the state. When the entity spawns, the animation goes from spawn state, which is in this case is the idle animation. Now for my example, I've already substituted the animation, which is one of the things I wanted to talk about. I wanted a different idle animation from entities that uses controller, and you can change two. Just Control D the controller from its location. You would find the controller down here, Control D, and it'll create a copy, and then I would just drag that copy over to my Asia Elderly Man. Now that way I'm working on my copy. Because this controller is kind of large, it may take a few seconds for it to actually copy. Once you have a copy, you can edit it all you want without messing up the default one because, and this is very important, any change made to controller is made to all entities and use that controller going forward. So if I were to edit the default one and then later export a different entity that happens to use the same controller, it's going to update with the new controller. Entities are exported with the controller assigned to the prefab. That's this puppy right here. Just like materials are. So if you don't make copies, you're making changes to all entities using it. Anyway, so this is the entity has a default spawn state. Square names don't matter of an idle animation. So this happens to be an idle animation. All right, I can click on it and I can click play, and then see it's just sort of moving. The next transition or arrow is what happens next. You will see a conditions list is empty. See the list is empty? It even says so. This means that when this is ran, it will go from entry to spawn state to default empty state automatically. It's just going to go from here to here to here because there's no conditions between in here or here. So just automatically go to here. All right. Click the default empty state because this is where it really begins. You'll note it also has an idle animation. I'm not certain why there are two of these things that do the same thing, but the Zith is very thorough, so there must be a reason. My disclaimer is that I only know what I have needed to know based on what I wanted to do. Zith knows a lot more because he's a lot more interested in how things work, so I don't question his work. Okay, so now when I zoom out, I see that there are many transitions or white lines that connect to the square. The lines have arrows indicating the direction to go. So now I'm going to look for the one that leaves the square. So when I look at these, I see this one's going towards the square, blah, 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 blah. and towards the square, towards the square, towards the square, blah, blah, blah. And then I find, where is it? This one right here. This is the only one that leaves this square. All right. When I click the line, there's a condition based on those parameters. Because it appears, let me back up a second. The arrows indicate the direction that it goes, so now I'm going to look for the one that leaves the square. It appears to be this one. You will see that it is the only line leaving the square, so this is the next animation step no matter what. When I click the line, there is a condition based on those parameters. This one is dead is false. This condition is called a bool or boolean. It's true, basically true false. It basically says if the entity isn't dead, go here. So let's follow it. Okay, when we follow it, it leads to the move square. When I click it, you see there are no animations attached to it. There's no animations attached to it. Okay? And that is because it has more than one line going from it. Each will have conditions. So think of this like a train station. The conditions set the destination. Here it can go either here or here, because you see they're the ones that leave, right? Okay, so we're going to be interested in, for this part of the example, swim human. Okay? Clicking on the line that leaves the swim human, we see that condition walk type equals -1. So what happens next is the game sends these parameters to the animation controller, telling the animation what to do. At some point, either by vanilla code or score, if a walk type gets changed to -1, then this will start the swim animation. Now, the reason why I mentioned score is because Zith worked with Sphere a lot to come up with custom game controller codes that get sent to these animations. That's why his Harley entity can do so many different things, because he worked with Sphere a lot and has a lot of custom conditions. So the game sees something happen and then says, oh, let's change it to this. And then Zith set up the controller so that this actually moves to an animation. That being said, the game sends a condition called walk type, -1, it will lead to swim human. All right? Clicking on the swim human box, we see something new, something called the blend tree. I'll explain more in the next box we talk about, but let's take a look at this one anyway. If we double click the swim human box to open up the blend tree, all right, looks kind of interesting. This is where it starts to get confusing, and I'm not going to get into it in this blend tree, but I will the next, I promise. Basically, if you click a blend tree box, you have options. Each motion is an animation. So what happens for this one, when you're not moving, your animation is treading water. All right? That's this right here. Let's move to the next square without going into detail here, because this was more confusing than the next one we're actually going to look at. Okay, so when I click back to base layer, it returns me to the base layer of the controller. So now we're going to click this one. This transition, actually let me do a recap. The entity spawns, goes to the spawn state, then to the default empty state, then move, and then if a walk type is -1, sent by code to the game controller, then the swim human. But that's not the usual behavior. Typically, an entity has a walk type value of 7 for NPCs, so let's click to transition from move to the other available square, locomotion type 7. Remember, these names are not important, because as you'll see, well, it's any walk type greater than -1. So it could be walk type 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. Basically, if the game has a walk type of 4, it will lead here. If it has a walk type of 3, it will lead here. So anything greater than -1, it's going to come to locomotion 7. All right? For some reason, the game sent if the game is sent a -2 walk type to the controller, when it's in this particular move state, the animation will not do anything because there's no transition from -2. Swim human is -1, and locomotion is anything greater than -1. But what if the game's in a condition of -2? Chances are there's nothing in the game that would do that. But let's say you add a new function that does, or you tell a buff to send that animation trigger. Your animation is just going to freeze, and it's going to be stuck in this loop. So what you can do is, you could add another condition. So if I have move, let's see, and the condition is walk type greater than -1. let me have everything swim, okay? So I have walk type equals -1, right? It's because there's no less than, and equal to, or greater than equal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add another condition that changes the walk type to less than -1. Oops. And that would cover all my bases. That means if it's a -2, it would still hit this transition. If it's a -5 billion, it would still hit this transition. That kind of gets rid of the potential for something going wrong in this particular controller. All right. You see how easy that is. Okay. When clicking the animation type 7 square, this is where things get interesting. The default animation is an idle animation. I change it to mine, but there's several options for what to go next. Selecting the transition to human walk 5. That's this one up here. All right. If wvar equals 5, it's going to walk type 5. If wvar goes to 4, it's going to walk type 4. Let's focus on 5 for a minute, though. This is where you could create a buff to change walk types, is because you can literally create a buff that uses a trigger like animation set int, animation set bool, animator set int, animator set bool, or animator set float, and send your own numbers to the animator. So you could force wvar to equal 5 through XML and force this transition as long as the current transition is in locomotive type 7. So you can actually change the walk types dynamically using CVARs, not CVARs, using animation triggers, which is a trigger in the event system to set the walk types. So hopefully that makes sense to you. All right. Selecting the transition to human walk var, I see the condition of walk var equals 5. This is what moves the entities. I talked about the buffs already. When I click on the human walk var 5 square, you see it's another blend tree. Let's explore this one because this one's less complicated. Double click it. All right. Give me a second. Let me scroll something here because I'm reading from list. Selecting the blend tree box, I see that there are 4 animations tied to this blend tree. This is how characters smoothly transition from a walk to a run. Unity does this automatically using blend trees, but we have to set up the parameters for it. So the 4 animations: idle unarmed, walk forward unarmed, run forward unarmed, run fast forward unarmed. And they each have these little positions: position X, position Y. All right, forward is position Y, by the way. Okay, this isn't X, Y, Z in the traditional sense. Y is actually forward, where on a Unity prefab it'd be Z. So this is what we're dealing with. All right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hit play. Okay, I'm going to change this to 0, and I'm going to hit play. And that has the dude just sort of idle in there. He's just sort of chilling, right? You'll see that this particular animation is anything from 0 to 0.07. So I'm going to change it to 0.03. Can you see? He slowly walks, right? And then if I change it to 0.08, that's not within idle unarmed, right? Because this is between 0 and 0. And it's not within walk forward unarmed because it's between 0 and 0.07, but it still looks like he's walking. That's because Unity is making it transition from a walk to a run, so he's basically doing kind of a fast walk. All right. As we slide it faster and faster, you'll see the animation blend into the next animation. All right, I'm going to stop it around 0.35. All right, so you'll see from 0.35, this is the run animation. But once I go to 0.4, it'll go even faster, twice as fast. And the reason why is because 0.4 is that there's a speed factor here too. Basically, it's called change animation speed. This is 1 times the speed. This is 1 times the speed. So basically, the default speed. This is twice the speed. This animation is twice as fast as this animation. And it's because it's running at a 2. Me, I would have just personally used this animation and changed it to 2 here, but it doesn't make a difference. All right. So the trick here is when you bring in a new entity, matching the animation speed to the correct blend tree ranges. If you bring in an entity and it goes from standing still to a run, or let's say the animation is running but the entity in game itself is actually standing still, so it's basically doing a run in place, chances are very high it's these numbers here. We need to change the numbers here to match the 7 days to die speed to get the correct animation for the correct speed. I know that sounds complicated, all right, but basically if an animation is set to move slowly, then we need to have these positions move at a much lower number so that the unity speed matches the animation speed. If an animation's default run is set super fast, like a Sonic the Hedgehog animation is probably super fast, these would be much higher numbers. So this is where we set those parameters. So anytime we bring in a new entity, we have to mess around with the animation speeds to kind of find the numbers that work for that particular animation. Alternatively, we can speed up and slow down the animations right here. I could do a 0.5, do a 0.3, whatever like that, like you see, or I can go 5. All right. Let's leave it at 2 though. Okay. This particular entity is what's called root motion. What that means is when the animation plays, the animation drives the speed in game. Your older entities, the game drives the speed of the animation. Very different. It's why you see the ground moving on the little test run here is instead of just the guy running in place, is because this is a root motion animation. All right? The faster the animation, the faster it moves in game. Sort of. 7 days was not originally coded for root motion, so you often see conflicts between XML speed and animation speed. This is what we have to adjust. So if you want to use root motion animations, the animations themselves have to be root motion. It is a different type of animation. We already know there's a difference between mechanism information and animations, which is just generic humanoid animations, but there's a humanoid root motion subset of humanoid animations. This tutorial or video does not cover how to make an animation root motion, but you can do that using an Autodesk program called Motion Builder. You can get it for free with an EDU account, otherwise it's like a couple of $1,000 as Autodesk likes to do. But basically you can take a non-root motion animation and turn it into a root motion animation, and then you could use it in game as root motion. Root motion is superior than non-root motion. I'll go over that a little bit. But basically, if you have an entity that you got from the asset store and the animations are not root motion, make sure you have both the entity not having that root motion and the XML having root motion equals false property. Very important. Okay? I put him back to it like a slow walk. He's just chilling. Sorry, I'm a little sick. Root motion is really only necessary for movement, so it doesn't really matter if the attack, idle, death, etc. animations are not root motion. It's nice to have attack animations root motion, but the game does not support attack animations for root motion. So that's why if you look at some fancier attack animations, you'll see the feet slide on the ground rather than with the ground. That's the difference between root motion and non-root motion. So that's why like fancy tornado kicks or something like that wouldn't really work in this game, because you'll basically, the entity will be standing and still when it's doing it, unless you set up your blend tree, and it just gets super complicated. It can be done, but it's super complicated. All right, anyway, moving on. All right, going back to the base layer. All right, another transition leads to happy walk var 4. When I click on the transition, this condition is w var equals to 4. All right, so let's see what that does. So if the condition is 5, it goes to this animation. If the same condition is 4, it goes to this animation. So I'm going to click it. I'm going to see it's also root motion. All right, let's double click it, see what it looks like. I click play, and this idle animation is a happy idle. It's a different animation, idle information, than the other one is, as you can see, right? So this one looks more loose, more relaxed. You could theoretically set up your entity to use this one as the default, and then once he's alerted to something or once he's sensed some sort of danger, you can use the other blend tree, all by simply changing in XML even. I'll show you. W var from 4 to 5. And instead of having this happy-go-lucky animation, he'll have this animation. Oops. A little more serious. You could have even a more serious animation where he's holding a gun or he's looking around more. It's some sort of alert animation. All controlled by whether or not this little thing bugger right here, wvar equals something else. All right? Okay. Going back to the base layer, you see the next one is injured leg wvar 3. All right? This transition, if you wanted to guess, is going to be setting that same transition, that same condition to 3. Let's see what it does. Another blend tree. Let's double click it. And you see this one's animation. He's got some sort of injury, right? I'm going to move him forward, and he's going to kind of hobble along, right? So far, so good. All right. Now, you could run buffs to track the entity's health, and if, say, for instance, it's below 25%, it sets WVAR to 3, and he will basically have this animation all the time. So that's a good way to, like, have a very dynamic character that has different animations based on different conditions. You basically just set WVAR to the different numbers, and it'll send it to the different animations. So you can see that this is generally how an animation controller works. It makes choices based on transition controllers, and can get super complicated very easily. But let me just move this real quick to point 4. Now you'll see he's moving much slower than the other animation was in point 4. In a root motion animation, this will be his actual speed. He will run physically slower, and XML will not be able to change that because the animation is driving the speed. In a non-root motion entity, the XML still drives the speed. Okay? So you could basically have an entity move faster or slower based on animation states, which we can use those triggers we talked about earlier to set. The animator set bool, animator set float, animator set int. Now what are all those different things? That's these different parameters right here. Okay? Going through the possible parameters, if you wanted to add a parameter, you add a float, an int, a bool, or a trigger. Okay? I'm going to look at a trigger real quick. Let's say is jump. Let's see, jump start. Okay, so basically, when this is on, now I don't have it running through the full motion, so you're not going to be able to see it over here. In fact, just ignore that. Basically, the game sends a trigger when it comes up to when the game says, okay, the code says, all right, I'm at a block. There's another block in front of it that's low enough for me to jump to. I'm going to send a trigger called jump start. So some of these are TFP trigger names, some of these are Zith and Sphere trigger names, and bool names, and float names. All right? This happens to be a trigger. So it basically does that. And that fires an animation to go to the jump. All right? Let me go back to the base layer because I missed a fairly important part. Okay? We have is climbing, which could be true or false. So basically that's true, that's false. That's different than a trigger. So basically when it hits a ladder, it goes it is climbing and then starts the climbing animation. Alright. We have hit body part, which is super complex because this is a paint animation. We have like different body parts. We have the leg, we have the arm, we have the head. So sometimes you hit a zombie on its right arm and it does a different animation than it does when you hit it on its left leg. This is what drives that. You basically select the pain walking right leg. See, that thing. You've seen that before, right? Here's the right arm one. And these are all based on body parts. Hit body part equals 4. Movement state equals 0. So if it's not moving and the body part is 4, then it will play this animation. Okay? And so you see the pain animation. TFP went through a lot of trouble to design this. This is a lot of different animations for the different events that can happen. This is the guy, if he's running and he hit his head, right? So that would be His body part has to be 2. His movement state has to be 0. He can't be dead, and his walk type has to be 8, which is the crawler's walk type. So you see all the different controllers handle different things. I mean, all the different conditions handle different things. This is a walk type, but it can't be 4 or it can't be 8, and it will do head left. So the crawler will never have this head animation. All right. Neither will whatever uses walk type 4. Okay. Now let's talk about any state. Let's go back to the base layer. Base layer. So now I'm looking for this puppy right here. All right. So any state is a square that allows conditions to be met from, well, any state. So whereas earlier I talked about how you would have to be in a specific square in order for an animation to fire, that's true, unless you have one coming out of any state. Dance is a great example. All right. Let me go back to parameters. All right. So when I have this transition, if is dancing gets set to 1, and I don't know why they didn't use the trigger for this, but I guess that way you can keep it dancing. It'll go to this animation. All right, from any state you're in. So even if an entity is in its dying state, if for whatever reason the Twitch event starts to dance, that entity is going to start to dance, even if it's doing its death animation. Now, once the entity dies, it dies, of course, and then animations no longer apply. But that, or a pain animation, a running animation, a ladder animation, any animation state, because this trigger has one condition, is dancing equals 1, it's going to, from any state, play this animation. All right? Mixamo has a thriller dance, for instance, broken down into 4 different animations. So you could actually change this dance to the Mixamo thriller dance 1, right? And then when it's finished, have it move to the part 2, part 3, and part 4. And you can have it set up that on his blood moons, a trigger gets sent out, and then all your entities do the thriller dance. That could be kind of cool, be kind of dumb, but you can actually do it that way. But this generally is how controllers work as I know them. Hopefully you find this useful.